There's a specific miscalculation worth examining directly, one narcissists make with almost predictable consistency the moment they cross someone who has actually done the work of becoming a super empath rather than remaining the earlier, more exploitable version of an empath. This entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations. Today, we're tracing exactly what this dangerous mistake consists of, why it happens so reliably despite how costly it eventually proves, and why understanding it protects you from ever doubting the power of exactly what you've become. Let's start with understanding the mistake itself, because its precise nature explains everything that follows throughout the rest of this conversation. The mistake: he treats crossing you the same way he's treated crossing every previous partner, assuming the same tactics will produce the same familiar outcome. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how heavily narcissistic strategy depends on pattern matching, applying approaches that have worked reliably across previous relationships with reasonable confidence they'll continue producing similar results. This confidence isn't unfounded in most cases. It's built on genuine, repeated success throughout his relational history, success that's taught his psychology a consistent, reliable formula. Push, test, escalate slightly, watch for compliance or emotional destabilization, then either continue pushing further or briefly retreat before eventually pushing again. Here's why this formula fails so completely and so dangerously against a genuine super empath, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout our conversation about why she becomes his worst enemy. Remember what we established about the specific combination that makes this particular kind of empath so uniquely resistant: genuine depth paired with hard-won discernment, warmth without exploitable neediness, perception that sees clearly and refuses to be argued out of what it accurately perceives. When he crosses her using exactly the tactics that worked reliably before, he's not simply failing to produce his usual result. He's actively, unknowingly revealing the entire mechanism of his own manipulation to someone whose specific psychological architecture is uniquely equipped to recognize, name, and permanently remember exactly what she's witnessing. Here's the specific danger this mistake creates, worth understanding in careful detail. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about betraying a super empath permanently, the way her perception, once fully developed, cannot be successfully argued back out of accurate understanding. When he crosses her assuming the same tactics will work, he's essentially handing her exactly the evidence she needs to complete whatever remaining doubt might have existed before this specific crossing occurred. Every previous partner who lacked her specific level of developed discernment might have absorbed this same crossing with lingering confusion, extended self-doubt, continued hope that perhaps she'd misunderstood or overreacted. A genuine super empath, by contrast, processes this exact moment with considerably more clarity, considerably more speed, and considerably more permanence than his psychology has learned to expect from anyone he's previously encountered. Here's why this matters so significantly for understanding the specific danger involved. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology depends on maintaining narrative control, on being perceived favorably, regardless of what actually occurred. When he crosses a super empath specifically, he's not simply risking one relationship's continuation. He's risking creating, permanently and completely, someone whose accurate account of exactly who he is cannot be successfully discredited. Someone whose eventual withdrawal won't follow the more familiar, more reversible pattern he's grown accustomed to navigating with previous partners. Here's the first specific way this mistake manifests, worth tracing in concrete detail. He assumes his usual escalation pattern, pushing slightly further, watching for her reaction, calibrating his next move based on whether this produces compliance or destabilization, will function the same way it's functioned before. Remember everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about how a super empath challenges a narcissist. Instead of the anxious accommodation or the emotional reactivity his previous experiences trained him to expect and successfully navigate, he encounters calm, factual observation that offers him genuinely nothing to work with. This absence of familiar material doesn't simply frustrate his immediate goal. It removes his entire capacity to calibrate his next move, because calibration depends on reading a reaction his usual crossing consistently fails to produce. Here's the second specific way this mistake manifests, connecting to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about narrative reconstruction and its typical success. He assumes that whatever version of events he eventually constructs, minimizing his own behavior, repositioning himself as reasonable, framing her response as disproportionate or unstable, will eventually prevail, exactly as it has with people whose perception remained easier to discredit throughout his previous relational history. What he doesn't anticipate is the specific quality of her perception, developed through exactly the kind of painful, comprehensive healing we've traced across dozens of previous conversations, which makes her account considerably more difficult to successfully argue against than anything his previous experience has prepared him to navigate. Here's the third specific way this mistake manifests, one worth understanding as perhaps the most consequential of all. He assumes that whatever emotional investment she's shown throughout the relationship indicates the same kind of exploitable dependency his previous partners have typically demonstrated: the anxious need for his approval, the fear of losing access to him, the desperate hope that patience will eventually produce the change she's been waiting for. Remember, everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine wholeness developed through sustained internal work rather than dependency built on external validation. A genuine super empath's investment in the relationship, however real and however deeply felt, was never actually built on the kind of desperate need his previous experience has taught him to expect and successfully exploit. This means when he crosses her, expecting this investment to keep her tethered despite the crossing, he encounters something his psychology has genuinely no framework for processing: someone whose care for him never actually required her own self-abandonment in order to exist, which means it can be released completely and permanently without the extended exploitable struggle his previous experience has taught him to anticipate. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why this specific mistake proves so genuinely dangerous rather than simply inconvenient for him, connecting directly to everything we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations in this series. Remember what we established about the permanent structural cost that betrayal specifically produces: the closed door that cannot reopen, the private knowledge he now carries about his own capacity for harm, the specific comparison anxiety that follows losing access to exactly the quality of depth she uniquely provided. When he makes this mistake, assuming she'll respond the way everyone else has responded before, he's not simply failing to secure his usual outcome. He's actively triggering the entire cascade of permanent consequences this entire series has traced extensively across dozens of previous conversations, consequences that follow him considerably longer and considerably more completely than anything he's experienced with any previous partner whose perception and whose capacity for release remained less developed than hers. And this is where the mistake becomes even more significant, because the narcissist doesn't immediately realize that the relationship has fundamentally changed. He may interpret her calmness as temporary. He may assume she's processing her emotions. He may believe that if he gives her enough time, applies enough pressure, or reintroduces enough emotional familiarity, she'll eventually return to the role she occupied before he crossed her. That assumption becomes the second mistake built on top of the first. He doesn't understand that a super empath doesn't necessarily leave the moment she is hurt. She may remain present long enough to understand exactly what happened. She may observe rather than react. She may become quieter, not because she's confused, but because she's finally collecting information without allowing her emotions to interfere with what she already sees. This distinction matters enormously. In earlier stages of her life, being hurt might have triggered an immediate attempt to repair everything. She might have explained herself repeatedly. She might have searched for the right words. She might have tried to make him understand how deeply his behavior affected her. She might have offered another chance because she believed that if he could only understand the pain, he would finally understand the need to change. But a genuinely healed empath begins operating from a completely different question. Not, how do I make him understand what he did? But what does what he did tell me about who he is? That question changes everything. Because when the focus shifts from changing him to understanding the information his behavior has provided, manipulation becomes considerably harder to sustain. He can deny. He can minimize. He can blame. He can become angry. He can suddenly become affectionate. He can promise that everything will be different. But none of those reactions erase what she has already observed. And this is precisely where the narcissist's usual strategy of emotional confusion begins losing effectiveness. He may expect tears. He may expect anger. He may expect a long emotional conversation. He may expect her to demand explanations. Instead, he encounters something much more difficult to manipulate: observation without immediate emotional surrender. She listens, she watches, she remembers, and she doesn't necessarily tell him everything she's thinking. This silence can be profoundly confusing for someone accustomed to reading emotional reactions as a form of access. If she is angry, he knows where to push. If she is crying, he knows where to offer temporary comfort. If she is desperate for reassurance, he knows exactly what promises to make. If she is demanding an explanation, he knows exactly how to redirect the conversation. But when she becomes quiet and internally decisive, his usual map becomes unreliable. He may even increase his efforts because he interprets her silence as resistance that needs to be broken. And this is where escalation can begin. He may suddenly become unusually affectionate. He may remind her of beautiful memories. He may talk about everything they've been through together. He may say that nobody understands him like she does. He may suddenly become vulnerable. He may tell her that he can't imagine his life without her. None of these things necessarily mean genuine transformation has occurred. Sometimes they're simply attempts to restore the previous emotional arrangement. The critical question isn't whether his emotions look intense. The question is whether his behavior has fundamentally changed. A super empath who has developed genuine discernment begins learning to separate emotional intensity from emotional integrity. Someone can cry and still manipulate. Someone can apologize and still repeat the behavior. Someone can say they love you and still behave in ways that make love impossible to experience safely. Someone can fear losing you without actually becoming capable of treating you differently. This is one of the most important lessons in the entire process. Don't measure change by how strongly someone reacts to the possibility of losing you. Measure it by what they consistently do when they no longer fear losing you. Because temporary fear can produce extraordinary performances. Sustained character produces consistency. And the narcissist may make another dangerous assumption, that time will weaken her clarity. He may believe that eventually the intensity of the betrayal will fade. He may expect loneliness to return. He may assume nostalgia will become stronger than memory. He may imagine that once enough time has passed, she'll remember the good moments more vividly than the reason she left. Sometimes that happens, but when someone has genuinely processed the relationship rather than simply escaped from it emotionally, time can actually strengthen clarity. Distance creates perspective. The emotional intensity decreases. The nervous system settles. The constant pressure disappears. And without that pressure, she can finally evaluate the relationship without being pulled back into every familiar emotional cycle. She remembers not only what she loved, she remembers what she tolerated. She remembers how often she questioned herself. She remembers the promises. She remembers what happened after those promises. She remembers how many times she confused potential with reality. And eventually, the story becomes much simpler. She doesn't need to hate him. She doesn't need to expose him. She doesn't need to punish him. She simply no longer needs the relationship to validate what she already knows. That is the point at which his leverage begins disappearing. Because emotional leverage depends on something the other person desperately needs from you: attention, approval, reassurance, access, forgiveness, a second chance. When those things are no longer being offered automatically, the old dynamic loses its foundation. And this is why the narcissist's attempt to recreate the old relationship can become increasingly intense. He may test whether she still reacts. A message arrives, then another. Perhaps a memory is mentioned. Perhaps a mutual friend is contacted. Perhaps something deliberately provocative is posted publicly. Perhaps he suddenly appears concerned about her. The specific tactic can vary. The underlying question remains the same. Can I still affect her? If she responds exactly as before, the old dynamic may restart. If she doesn't, he receives information he wasn't expecting. And that information isn't necessarily that she is stronger than him. It's something much simpler. She is no longer emotionally organized around his behavior. That is a profound difference. A super empath doesn't become powerful because she learns how to destroy a narcissist. She becomes powerful because she stops making her healing dependent on what the narcissist does next. She doesn't need him to regret it. She doesn't need him to admit it. She doesn't need him to become jealous. She doesn't need him to come back. She doesn't even need him to understand what he lost. Her life can continue without any of those things happening. And that is precisely why the narcissist's original calculation fails. He calculated based on her previous attachment. She has changed the equation. He calculated based on her previous reactions. She has developed new responses. He calculated based on her fear of losing him. She has discovered that losing herself was far more costly. He calculated based on her empathy. He failed to understand that empathy and access are not the same thing. And this is where the narcissist finally encounters the consequence he never properly calculated for. Not revenge, not destruction, not some dramatic punishment, but the complete loss of access to the version of you that once kept trying to make the relationship work. He may have expected anger, because anger still contains connection. He may have expected confrontation because confrontation still gives him something to argue with. He may have expected tears because tears reveal emotional investment. What he wasn't prepared for was the possibility that you could simply reach a point where none of those things were necessary anymore. This is the moment when the entire dynamic begins reversing. Before, he could create tension and wait for you to react. Now you observe. Before, he could create confusion and watch you search for explanations. Now you trust the pattern. Before, he could withdraw and expect you to chase. Now his withdrawal is simply information. Before, he could hurt you and wait for you to prove how much you cared. Now, your care no longer requires self-abandonment. And this is why the dangerous mistake wasn't simply crossing you. The deeper mistake was assuming that your empathy guaranteed unlimited access. It doesn't. Empathy is the ability to understand and feel deeply. It isn't an agreement to tolerate everything. Compassion isn't consent. Understanding isn't permission. Forgiveness isn't reconciliation. And love isn't an obligation to remain available to someone who repeatedly violates your trust. A genuinely healed empath eventually learns these distinctions in a way that changes everything. She may still understand why he behaves the way he does. She may even recognize the wounds beneath his behavior. She may understand his fear of rejection, his insecurity, his need for validation, or his inability to tolerate vulnerability. But understanding the mechanism doesn't require her to become its victim. This is where many people misunderstand the idea of becoming a super empath. It isn't about developing some supernatural ability to defeat a narcissist. It isn't about becoming more manipulative than the manipulator. It isn't about learning psychological tricks that allow you to control someone who once controlled you. The real transformation is much quieter. You become harder to manipulate because you become harder to separate from your own reality. You don't need someone else to confirm what you experienced. You don't need their permission to establish a boundary. You don't need their agreement before walking away. You don't need their apology before accepting what happened. And you don't need their regret to know that losing access to you was a consequence of their choices. This creates a completely different psychological environment. The narcissist may still attempt the same tactics. He may try guilt. He may try nostalgia. He may try anger. He may try charm. He may try silence. He may try making you jealous. He may suddenly become extremely attentive. He may remind you of the person he was during the best moments of the relationship. And this is where your discernment becomes more important than your emotional reaction. Don't ask, which version of him is real? Ask, which pattern has been consistent? Because manipulation often relies on making you evaluate isolated moments rather than the entire history. One beautiful conversation can temporarily overshadow months of disrespect. One emotional apology can make you forget repeated broken promises. One affectionate weekend can make you question whether the relationship was ever truly harmful. But healing teaches you to zoom out. You stop evaluating the relationship by its best moments. You evaluate it by its overall pattern. And that is an enormous psychological shift, because anyone can create a beautiful moment. Consistency is much harder. Anyone can promise. Sustained accountability is harder. Anyone can become emotional when they fear losing someone. Long-term behavioral change is harder. And this is why the super empath becomes difficult to pull back into the old cycle. She no longer confuses emotional intensity with transformation. She no longer mistakes access for intimacy. She no longer assumes that being needed means being loved. She no longer interprets jealousy as proof of value. She no longer believes that someone fighting to keep her necessarily knows how to treat her well. This doesn't mean she becomes cold. In fact, the opposite can happen. She becomes warmer because her kindness is no longer driven by fear. She becomes more generous because generosity is no longer being used to purchase security. She becomes more loving because love is no longer confused with self-sacrifice. And she becomes more selective because she finally understands that not everyone deserves unlimited access to her depth. That is the transformation the narcissist never expected. He thought your greatest weakness was how deeply you cared. He didn't understand that your greatest strength could eventually become the clarity produced by that same depth, because deep feeling creates deep grief. But when that grief is fully processed, it can also create deep understanding. You remember what happened. You understand why it happened. You recognize the pattern. And eventually, you stop needing the pattern to change. That is when acceptance becomes more powerful than confrontation. You no longer spend every morning wondering what he is doing. You no longer check whether he has contacted you. You no longer analyze every social media post. You no longer need mutual friends to tell you whether he regrets losing you. You no longer need to know whether he is happier with someone else. Your attention returns to your own life. And this is one of the most important signs that the cycle is genuinely ending. Your attention is no longer organized around him. You start making plans without considering how he will react. You begin rebuilding relationships that became distant while you were consumed by the relationship. You rediscover interests you abandoned. You sleep more peacefully. You make decisions faster. You stop explaining yourself so much. You stop rehearsing imaginary conversations in your head. You stop imagining the day when he finally understands everything. And one day, something very strange happens. You realize that you no longer care whether he understands. That doesn't mean the experience didn't matter. It means the experience no longer controls your emotional future. And if he eventually recognizes what he lost, that's his journey. If he doesn't, that's also his journey. Your healing doesn't need to wait for his realization. This is where the title becomes fully understood. The dangerous mistake narcissists make when they cross a super empath isn't that they underestimate her ability to fight back. They underestimate her ability to stop fighting altogether. They assume every conflict must end with emotional engagement. They assume every wound creates another opportunity for manipulation. They assume every boundary is eventually negotiable. They assume enough time will restore the old dynamic. They assume love guarantees access. And eventually they discover that none of those assumptions were permanent truths. The empath they thought they understood has changed. Not into someone cruel, not into someone vindictive, not into someone obsessed with revenge, into someone who finally understands that peace is more valuable than proving a point. And that is the final lesson. You don't have to become more powerful than the person who hurt you. You don't have to defeat them psychologically. You don't have to make them suffer. You don't have to make them regret what they did. You don't even have to make them understand. You simply have to become unavailable for the pattern. Because when you stop participating in the cycle loses its ability to define you. And if the narcissist experiences that as shocking, frustrating, or destabilizing, that's a consequence of the change, not the purpose of it. Your purpose is not to become their worst enemy. Your purpose is to become your own safest place. The moment you stop abandoning yourself to preserve someone else's comfort, everything changes. The person who once believed they could hurt you and still keep unlimited access discovers that access was never theirs to own. It was always something you chose to give. And now finally you understand that you are allowed to choose differently.